다 단단한 주 뒤쪽에 봐. 고고. 고된 주비지고 가르래. 고고 주비지고 치고다.
What's the reason to prove liberation or liberation? No, give me the whole thing. What's the subject? Not the subject. Dungil chojes. Dungil chojes.
간디사?
Dungil chojes. Tenduwa mainte. Rangi gyu rigla. Nyembuto dungil.
유비에시스. 그래서 와. 어디시? 나디시디 추진 가르샤.
What's the subject? Dungil.
둥에르와. 소자다 디나로 둥에스 추진 요버인데 아니 딜라 삼로 든디시 땅나야고 요래. 둥에 추진 말라버체. 아니 둥엘기 풍부디 추진. 예면은 풍부디 추진스. 둥에베 풍부디 추진스. 그래서 와.
So instead of just saying suffering, maybe it's better to say like the suffering aggregates. That might be more.
와. 둥에베 풍부디 추진스. 다 예면은 약쇼들라 가도 그런 거죠. 단다 수수기 풍부지로 다가랑 풍부디 추진스라 도와체.
Or better still, just say one's own aggregates, the ones that we have. So like my aggregates.
이제 다 디인디 아니 추진디 다 따디 가랑 죽고요 그러봐. 딘시 꿍이디 추진디 두고로 두고 말해.
The person who gives the reason, do they need to be able to establish the subject? Yeah?
와. 디인디 당보 가리 두고래 풍부디 둥에와 두고래. 그래서 소자다 풍부디 둥엘이 뭐 가족이 로라 차투나 아니 추진디 두기요래.
So that means that the subject, which are one's aggregates, have to be first known to be suffering, and the clearer or the more certain one's understanding of the aggregates being the nature of suffering is, the closer one is getting to understanding the subject.
디인디다 풍부 둥에와 개대 탄다 통투기 메나 디코랑 동양의 비준시가 봐.
Whereas if this is not clear, like the aggregates being suffering is not clear, or not, one is not certain about that, then for the time being, that itself should be what one's kind of attention is focused on.
다 풍부 둥에와 통창해질다. 통창해 통퉁해질라. 아니 신이 둥이 풍부디 추진스라고 추진디 신딜레 와.
So when after having like paid attention to it and having analyzed it and understood that the aggregates are the nature of suffering, for someone who has understood that the aggregates are suffering, then there is the subject. So at that point, then take the aggregates that are the nature of suffering.
다 되니 디원이버디 다 시소나 양결 풍부딘데 렌드 유베스 수수수 치고들려 버려.
And before you carry on with the rest of the syllogism, the question that one would ask oneself is whether after dying or after this life ends, whether I want to find myself having similar aggregates once again, or aggregates of this sort once again.
와 풍부딘다 왔으디 둥에와 hingi 풍부디 렌드 유베스.
So this sort of aggregates means aggregates that are suffering. Do I want to have aggregates that are suffering one more time?
다디 티월레 용디 렌드 유스 얘기 되바디 렌드 유스라 렌디 쑥 겹기래 최진 마중이디 풍부 둥에와 마통댕이디기 렌드 유 강이 개미도 어디를.
So if someone says yes, the only way that you can say yes to this is if you haven't understood that the aggregates are the nature of suffering. Only such a person would say yes.
다 풍부 둥에와 통댕이디기 추진 딱딱 좁댕이디기 lende yues lana lende mes di lende ligista.
And someone who has understood, on the other hand, that they are the nature of suffering, will naturally say, I do not want them again.
Dixwa ta phungbu lende mena ani 가르쳐 오래. 풍부 di lende mena gyu ka 오래. gyu magana jibu do mitu badi gyunde gi chunyi re.
So then, one who does not want them, it's for them not to, or to make sure that they don't come about again. Then what needs to be worked on is the cause, because if the causes are there, the effect arising is the nature of a cause.
Pande churagi tanda semandamdi gi shung na lola matsang megyu telani jibu khangi tokpar chesla.
So there's a verse by Acharya Dharmakirti in the Pramanavartika itself that says, causes that are not incomplete, what can prevent the effect from arising?
So the di indu ta jibu di dogona gyu di dogore. Gyu dogu gu yoba indu ani phungbu lembi gyu kharare shaas. Ta phungbu lembi gyu nyen mangbu yobe nanglo ne phungbu lembi gyu zogo di kharare. Ta chiwa di tangore.
At which point then the question is, if the causes need to be reversed, then which cause, then I guess then identifying the cause is the priority, and amongst all the various causes that there might be, identifying the primary cause then becomes the next most important thing.
Ta phungbu lembi gyu zogo kharare.
So then what is the main cause for taking on aggregates? Sise. Which what? Tanzin lamnyendu, seba lamnyendu, sise lamnyendu. Then sumst.
Ta khazang anzo rudi khari chinso phungbu lembi gyu kharare laso.
When we
ngazo yewa ni chen ba phungbu lembi gyu zogo jigda phungbu lembi gyu jigda phungbu lembi gyu zawa jigsi. Khazang ngazo yewa ni chen ba.
So don't forget what we did previously, which is there's the cause and then there's the root cause, if you will. So there's the cause and then there's the root. So don't forget this distinction that was made. So what is the so what is the main cause, not the root? What is the main cause? Nito. Seba la niendo, danzin la niendo.
Ta pungbo lembe gyu zo karire islamna seba. Yeswa di nyebar tul sha.
Please
zawa kari mi chiju chogo mare. Pungbo len chunge gyu zo di kari chigi du islamna seba la thank you.
So what one needs to be absolutely certain with is we're not talking about the root here, we're talking about the main cause. And the main cause that is said or that has been identified, or what is the main cause, is craving. So please don't forget that. And then where does craving come from? Then you go to the root of craving, which is then self-grasping. But when the root cause, when you're asking what is the main cause, not the root, the main cause, then that's craving. That has to be like, please keep that clear.
Pungbu lembi gyutso seba yimbadi ngazo kunjun demba she yundu rabje de gengi namba she yundu seba so she de khazang zo geje she yimba marikba de kapdir marikba she gi mes le yang she gi mes khazang zo zawaji chinyor chinyor mare marikba yang she gi me le yang thanda pungbu lembi gyutso wol she gi mes lan khazang zo droy mare.
Yes, previously when we looked at the truth of causes, the third and fourth aspect, which is strong production and condition, do you remember how we looked? There was those verses that very clearly said, we're not calling the main cause over here ignorance, nor are we causing karma the main cause. What the main cause here is craving. Do you remember that we went through those verses? Does anyone have that verse memorized? Just recite it.
Even though nescience is the cause of existence, it is not mentioned, and instead only craving is. This is because craving impels a continuity, and it impels a continuity, and it's the immediate cause. Nor is karma mentioned, because if that exists, that does not have to exist.
대가라. sonda 미시 시비 규인 마주 세바 니셰바 규니 펜바 제제다 대마타지 레게민스. 오늘에는 직지디도 스교 대가란 가라니 사모도 스탄 곰견 되었다. 또 곰에 먹고 쉬어야 디나르다 곰게 된저다.
So then if you can like recall this verse, just reciting it and then thinking about it itself is the first, if like when we asking what do we meditate on, just bringing this verse to mind and contemplating on the meaning of this verse itself is what one is meditating on or what one should meditate on. So this text is constantly giving input on what to meditate on. This is one such example.
다 단다 자와디기 마리과 시기메 레연 시기메 규조의 세바니 시기여스 자와디르와 다 세바 규조의 임바 자와카리요레 줌젠 카리요레.
And then what is this verse says, craving, I'm not saying nescience is the cause, nor am I saying karma is the cause. I'm saying craving has been mentioned as the cause. After saying that, what's the reason it gives for craving being the cause? The main cause, do you remember?
Craving impels and intensifies.
Is that what you said? Impels and intensifies? Impels and immediately preceding, no?
다 단다 자와디 코로나라 줌젠 티니셰르와 다 디마임바 양 ngazo 카리셰바레 풍불네 조디 세바레 규조디 세바레세게 줌젠 코 카리셰요레.
So this was these two ones is in this verse it gives these two reasons. One is it impels and it is immediate. But then there was another verse that it said why craving is the main cause. Do you remember that one?
다 예면은 두슬람 디그와 다 세바디 규조레 라서와 수조다 풍불렘베 규조디 세바스 랍사디 풍불렘베 규조 세바텔라 낭세 가주시에레 단다 풍불레긴 자와디 자웨 세바디라고 말다 풍불렘베 단다 긴 세바셰디에게 세바텔라 아니 디 가주시에레 세바 민다 가주시에레.
Or to like if just to kind of clarify what the question is, when we said that the main cause is craving, this cause of existence that is craving, how many divisions of craving were mentioned as causes for craving? No, craving. Do you remember the root text had three kinds of, there were craving, yeah.
숨디카레.
What were these three? Dose, jikse, sise. Sise, dose, jikse.
dose, jikse. 디데메 자올로 용에 가져요.
How many of you remember the verses that had that mentioned these three cravings? Do you have them?
That mentioned these three. Because craving for existence, along with which craving for pleasure and craving for annihilation are asserted to be because this is craving for existence, along with which the desire to gain happiness and alleviate suffering are asserted to be craving for pleasure and craving for annihilation.
시드 규인스 디레 하나리도 자와 고교에 들어와 시드 규인스 아니 줌젠 가르레 미남 유기 개버니 용진 대도 삼베시스 디 줌젠 당부 시드 규 당부지 세바 당부지 다 데니 시드 강치 양 디투 도르 되바타 주버 되바 대단히 되도 직세 임버 되세디 세바 치마니 디시 오 디숨버디 로랑에 왔다.
So the verse, do you remember the one before that? That was the one that had craving for existence, and then it broke it down in two more.
This is like craving for existence is a cause.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
직송아 다 단기가래 풍부디 렌드메나 풍부디 규세고래 다 풍부디 렌베 규 가리 치기도 라인데 세바 치기도 세바 디숨디도 문지체 그래서 다시니 지월에 땅이 세바디 매버 체투그를 두고 말했어 세지 양결 치고들레다 가시는 풍부디다 풍부 세발라 풍부디 렌드 메로와 풍부디 렘버 미디오바 인디 세바 빵거와 다 세바 빵 투구를 두고 말해서 치고들레거래 디 치발레빈디 아니 세바디 자와 가리기 치기도 양결 제주 당기요다.
So then, if you just keep this order in mind, first there is no longer the wish to attain, like no longer the wish for existence. And then in identifying the main cause of being born again, the main cause is craving. When you say craving, bring these three cravings to mind. When you bring these three cravings to mind and you understand how they're the cause for existence, then, or the cause for samsara, then the next question naturally is, can these three be brought to an end? And so then now the next question is it possible to overcome or remove this kind of craving? So then that's the next step.
So that di pang tuye yor yomar, di serum pang tusare tuye yor yom, meba suye yor yomar is chiva tang yudu, di korang condition kigidu, zawa condition kigidu, korang digi zawa rauji du midu zeju tang warwa, zawa tang yudu, ani digi zawa di karishere.
So then now when you're looking at why these come about or where these come from, then now the next question is, what is the root of this, right? And so then what was said to be the root of these three kinds of craving?
Dangzi di chabarwa, ta di tembe zawa kariyore.
What was the root for the root verses for showing that grasping is the root? Does anyone remember? We went through 3-4 different kinds, remember? So the first one is from the cause that is attachment to self, non-pleasurable is regarded as pleasurable. That was one. Then the second one was as long as attachment to self is not destroyed, there will be torment caused by suffering. For that long, there will be superimposition. That's the second one. Then the next one is attachment comes from superimposing a self onto phenomena that are not the self. And then there's as long as there's a notion of self, there will be a notion of other, from self and other. Do you remember those? So those are all these various verses for how self-grasping acts as the cause.
Danzin meber chebala lo kangda kain lo teda te meber chebala dodan karre lo kangda kain ko meber chebala sodan di condition so gugure islam na.
So with these verses, then when you bring to mind these verses and you reflect on what they mean, then there is the certainty. One has to generate the certainty, so not just that it sounds right, but one has to be sure of how this process is unfolding. So gain certainty on the way the process happens. And if you can do that and you come to understand that all of this originates from or has self-grasping as its root, at that point, then the question is, how does one overcome this self-grasping? And then there was another discussion that we had touched upon, which was, how do you counter a mind such as self-grasping? And so what was the reasons or what was the explanation given for how you counter such as mind? Do you remember?
Powerful opposing force can act the antidote completely.
That's the kind of that's a little bit introductory, more precisely. That's the same thing.
lokanda kayina
The question is,
lokanda kayina ko mebar sogona sodandi karires.
if there is a mind and you want to eliminate it, what is the means to eliminate such a mind?
Generating a mind whose mode of apprehension is directly contradictory.
Zimbabwe.
손자 lokanda kayina ko mebar sogona lodigi shinyu sunchung bachi gore.
So, whatever mind you have, if you want to remove it, then its object has to be refuted. The object that it's engaging in needs to be refuted.
달로 태기 신유디 까토고 믿으나 로디기 신유디 까토고 믿으나 로디 까토고 말해.
If that object that it engages in cannot be refuted, then a mind that engages in that object also cannot be removed.
다 신유 까야 여다 매라이디 신유디 까토 마토라이디 신유디 일 마치바 잠라 신유 까라고 말해. 신유디 여다 매 때나 파비. 신유디 여나 까야 까투에 요 말해. 신유디 고비니줄 매나 안코 까토리.
So when you say you have to refute its object, refuting its object doesn't mean refuting it in terms of not bringing it to mind. Refuting it means checking whether it exists or not. And if it does exist, then you can't refute it, which means if it does exist, you can't, again, removing the mind, removing might not be the right word in English. Here you're talking about eliminating that mind, not just removing it, right? So, if the object does exist, then you can't do anything about eradicating that mind. If the object doesn't exist, then you can eradicate that mind. So, refuting its object means testing whether it exists or not, or checking whether it exists or not.
그래서 다 신유디 여바지 까마토나 디즈비 로디 까야 요 말해. 까 투에 요 말해. 다 내가 응은도 뭐 이거 소초그래. 이나야 그때 누구도 그러면 소토그래 별라나 투고 말했어.
And so if an object exists, or if it doesn't exist, but one is not sure that it doesn't exist, so one can't refute that it exists, and for that duration, you cannot eradicate the mind that grasps at that object. You can temporarily do various things to prevent it from arising, but you can't remove, in the sense that you cannot eradicate that mind until you are sure that that object doesn't exist. So until one refutes that object, you can't eradicate that mind entirely.
따온디 계란 셈 샤워.
So please do keep this in mind and remember this part.
맞아. 로는 님보 땡당디.
The way to apply antidotes to the mind, or mental antidotes.
So the mind training se kera chimbo chide ngoma dirida.
So when we say mind training, which we consider very precious and important, this is actually mind training. What it boils down to is this.
Mind training la rigni duwa. Chigdi khare semdi kyamma juba cheje. Sende migwa kawa khasala kyamma juba chi dagu gyabde de la mind training chiglab dirwa. Mind training ngoma di khare chigdi khare re nyokta songyen khare do nyokta songyen lo khando lo di shinyu ka ja lo di khorongo du kyulma ju so eti nibedir.
So when you say mind, when we commonly refer to mind training, there's mind training in the sense that one trains the mind not to get distracted, not to wander, and tie it to one thing. That's one form of mind training. But mind training also has a very strong component, which is identifying the source of problems, and then by realizing or investigating whether what that mind believes to exist exists or not, and then refuting that object, and then subsequently eradicating the problem creating minds, that's another form of mind training.
So the tangbodi shamatha sedri nibode vipassana sedri.
I think you understood that. The first of these is called shamatha, the second one is vipassana.
So the mind training ngoma dikhare lana tinjing zo dikhare lana chima dir.
So of these two, the main one, when you say I'm engaged in mind training, or this is mind training, the actual mind training is the later one, the second one.
Nibode tangbo koran ngom kor zo di.
Yeah. You have to start from the second one first. Yeah.
You start with the second?
Yeah.
Nibode zo gomne jogore tangbo di digi support la gomne jogore.
The,
ngonro gi sud kom.
the second one is done as your main practice. The first one is done as a support for that. But the main practice is the second one. It's Vipassana.
Ta di nangwa sangi begi mind training dire.
This is Buddhist, so-called Buddhist mind training. If you want to do it, that's how it is.
So za sangi jumden degi chö mangbu je songje ta tama chö gi domdi gya yundu o domdi gya ta digwa ji me je gyawa posum sogo ju rangi semni yongsu dul dini sangi demba is tama domdi gya ta.
So after all the things that the Buddha taught, like the summary of the whole thing was, how that was? Do not engage in any non-virtue, engage in lots of virtue, completely tame one's mind. That is the teaching of the Buddha.
So za ta rangi semni yongsu dul labe dik habdu tela ani sangi jumden degi dudan di sherab gi thone. Mi mashiwar chingi simgyu mashiwar chingi lo khanda khanyi bodi ngunzin che digi shenyu di ka digi midun shogi nyembo di ngodu gyune ani ko meba soyeje di dutab di sangi jumden degi rangi semni yongsu dul su dudan tilla brita.
So that one where the Buddha says, tame your mind, the taming part that the Buddha is saying, which is unique to the Buddha's teachings, is taming it by recognizing what the problem is and investigating whether the object of that exists, and after refuting that object, then taming the opposing forces by eradicating them, realizing that their object doesn't exist. That's the essence of the teaching of the Buddha.
But digi support de la karigorelana ani simzejik bud korta.
And to support that or to sustain this kind of investigative quality, shamatha is a support that allows one that to be more efficient. But it's a support for this one, which is the main one.
Odi. Ta di tula sha. Ta digi tsawa di tembe tsawa di. Logi midun nyebe midun sho kandiji meba sogo samgidu na sodan di shinyu ka ne meba sogo re segi ta di tembe tsawa di tandanga do shamla ligir. Di sunjum meba ni debon wani nyuma yins magi shamla lego.
And so please first keep this in mind, like let this be very clear. Okay? Then, now regarding how you refute its object, and without refuting its object, how you do not have an antidote to it, there's a root verse that comes further ahead that says without refuting its object, it cannot be eradicated. So that's going to come further ahead. But please keep this in mind.
Ta di chi ta ngaso karichaso. Dunge phungbo yangger lende me. Digi tsawa seba yim, digi gyudi seba yimba hako. Ta seba di meba sogo du, seba kandi yungu ta yode tsawa danzingi chigi yoba di she. Ta dile du tama de la, ta danzing meba soyegi samlo ka le sonwa. Danzing meba soyega le du ka la, ta danzing meba soyego na, danzingi shingyun ka ne meba soyena mado, rosa mindu se tanda ngazo kiji di she.
So, where we are is, first you identify what suffering is. This then leads to not wanting it anymore. And in not wanting to perpetuate or continue in such a state, you have tried to, you look for the cause. When you are able to identify the cause with craving, then you want to get rid of craving. When you want to get rid of craving, then you identify that the root of craving is self-grasping. And so you've come to self-grasping as the root from where all of this comes. And then when you're looking at self-grasping, to refute self-grasping, you have to gain certainty that the only way to do it is to refute the object that self-grasping engages in. There's no other alternative.
Ta digi samdela ani shini ta da danzingi da shemba nashi da du da yoba kelen nyuju khardo. Ani da di mebalo dubji gi rigba khardo. Ta du seje nyuju da dubji gi rigba du samlo naje ani dame kor khazanga ju mangbo geje shede da me segi mebi cholo dubji che yobi cholo nyuju gi rigba du tonga tone da mindu se di kaba ina da meba di sheba ina di shebe ani kaptela takari chabre ani shini dungye thamje gi zawa dungye gi phungbo gi zawa dangjing la nyuje gi nyembo tobden yoba di shebarta.
So then, when you come to this, so is that clear? When you come to this point where you're like, okay, the only way to refute self-grasping, if it can be eradicated at all, is by seeing whether what it conceives of exists or not. And so at that point, the entire focus becomes on trying to find the reasoning to see whether the self exists or not, which we've done. if you find that the reasoning to support the existence of a self is not valid, and you find that the reasoning, or the not reasoning in like external reasoning, but the mind's way of conceiving of a self is accurate or is not accurate, because when you reason it out, reasoning seems to suggest that there is no self or there can be no self, then when you undergo this kind of investigation and you find certainty that there is no support for reasoning, it's not reasonable for there to be a self, and instead selflessness is a more reasonable or is a more accurate way of existence, then at that point for the first time, so up until now you can't say that you know, but now for the first time you know that the root of all suffering has a strong antidote. Before this you can't even say that.
이 인도다 신이 가르차래 고된 주비 딘시디 신이 촉주 신이 주버다.
And when this happens is for the first time when you have the property of the subject in the proof that liberation is possible. Up until then, none of that has happened.
그래서 다 둥엘기 다 따디 가르쳐버려 녀랭기 풍부다 둥엘 풍부디 추진샤 다디 풍부디 세롱레 풍부디 렌데 메와 인데 풍부디 세야 요레 양자 풍부 렌메고 봤다 된다 풍부 세롱세도 풍부 양자 렌메고 차야 요레스는 차야 요레 김전 가르질라나 풍부디 렌중이 규디 자와라 뇌지기 년부터 된도 어디르.
So then your reason, now finally your reason is coming together, and the reason is take the aggregates or take my aggregates. It follows they are not, what is it? Eternal, right? Which basically means that it's possible for not having to take them again. That's what it means, right? So it's possible for not having to take them again because the root of their cause, so their cause and then its root has a strong antidote.
이래. 다 캬바 렐라보레 캬바 용어튼 두고 캬바 두벨을 리고 쉬고 땅고 말해. 퀴기 유이 싸와라 답에나 풍불림비 유이 싸와들 니지기 년부 dob된 이유나 아니 풍부디 레메고 차이여바디 디 용어튼은 가서 시에도 그래.
The pervasion is itself not particularly difficult. You can just experience, like you just know that, you can experience that. Which is, if something's cause has an antidote, it does not have to remain or it can be removed, is something, the pervasion is easy to know, that you know just experientially.
So 딱 깔레 카사디 촉주 주베들와 깔레 카사디 촉주 주베들에 so 촉주 주베디가나 조와된 거래. 캬바 주베디 맞아 용회 돈이 랍토그를 딜라 슈슈르바 깔레 카고디 깨져 말해. 배낭가주 신동들 깨지 시기이나 신동들 디고도 로마도 메도 항상에 깨디기 유나야 디기 짜와디 메버 소투에 유나 동보디 까메 여바디 맞아 용회 돈 시에도 그래.
So in this reason, the one that really is difficult if you consider it, or not difficult, but the one that requires more effort and the one that requires more time is the property of the subject. That's where one has to try and get clarity. That's what has to be clear or gain certainty with the property of the subject. The pervasion, once the property of the subject is there, the pervasion itself is not particularly hard, because we know that, for example, if you have a tree that is exceptionally beautiful and it's laden with really delicious fruit and beautiful flowers, but you know that if you remove the root, then all of that is going to dry up. That's something that you know experientially. You don't need any further proof.
다 덴디 고된 주비르고 디기 토네 고바 투비 용드 가리 투르레 아니 둥예기 풍부 세 여바다 덴디기 둥예기 풍부 세바디 고바 임바 아니 둥예기 풍부 렌중예기 규 자와다 아니 규 차소 세바디 시와 임바 가장 가서 고바 시와 근데 덴디기 차과 시바다 차소 녀모 시바다 당진 시바다 아니 둥예기 풍부디 매바 차바이나 레메고바지 차바이나 따딩고네기 대와임바디 캬노바임바디 아주 숨 가장 계제 시에서.
So when you understand this, then that removal of the causes, is that clear? That absence of the causes. When the causes can be removed, that absence of the causes is cessation. So that separation from the causes is itself cessation. So if you can prove that they are suitable to be removed, which is what you're doing, right? When you're saying they are not stable, it means that they can be removed. By understanding that they can be removed, that removal of the suffering of the contaminated of the aggregates that are suffering, that absence of that is what is cessation. And then that cessation, this is the first aspect of the truth of cessation, that cessation you can also prove is a state of peace, because it is the absence of afflictions, etc. And so that was the second aspect of the truth of cessation, which is peace. And then if you can attain such a state, and because such a state is possible, and because such a state exists, which you have proven through the reason to establish cessation, then that state is a sublime state. That state is a state of genuine, stable peace. And so then it's a sublime state, which was the third aspect of the truth of cessation.
다 자와디 매버 쇠차나 둥이기 풍복이 자와디 매버 쇠차버체 다가나신기 차소 녀바 차소 기에기 규 자와데 녀바 차소 기에기 계중에기 자와디 매버 쇠차세 매버디 쇠차바 이나야 양결 고니 차소 기 초그레스 세기 티워지여와 양결 고니 차소 기 초그레 세기 티워디 원이치나 렘싱이 소라오지요.
So is this clear? When you prove that you can remove it, you have established that there is a removal of afflictions. That's cessation. Cessation is establishing that there is a state without the root, which means you've identified the cause, you've identified the root, and you have proven that the root of suffering and the root of the afflictions can be removed. So there is the absence of this root of suffering, the absence of the root of afflictions. That absence is the truth of cessation. Is that fine? Now the other doubt that could arise is, even though this is attainable, later on, even though one has attained an absence of this root, afflictions could arise once again. That's a separate doubt. But actually, if you've understood that you can remove the root of this, then technically this later doubt shouldn't really come up.
답변을다 동부직체 동부직리게 되고 로마 지부카리 여바이나 디기 짜와디 견 땅차와시 짜와디 누메 쇠차비 제라 다 동부디 로마다 지부 양계 끼기래 디 동부디라 양계 로마다 지부 끼기래 라이기 도과디 리에 메교서로시 다 기시 양계 동부디 짜와 동부디 양계 로마다 지부 끼기도나 단다 짜와디 메바 소투 메베다 짜와디 메바 쇠차나 끼기 메와디 파지기 로는 예딩이라고 그래. 양게 니끼기를 래 독과디 얘기 요말다. 다 자와디 매바 소도 소면도 디타에르마도 자와 매바 쇠산의 양게 동거들로 로마도 디끼기를 생이 삼로도 수질이 요말다.
Why this doubt is unlikely is if you consider when you know that you have acted on the roots of a tree and you have kind of, you have destroyed these roots, right? Or you have uprooted them, then wondering whether after having uprooted them, the tree can give rise again, can produce fruit and produce leaves, is a doubt that no one really has. That's why if you have uprooted something, the fact that it can give rise to results again is a doubt that technically should not arise. If that doubt is arising, it's actually suggestive of the fact that we are not sure that the thing has been uprooted. So the doubt is not so much after it has been uprooted can they arise, but this is more suggestive of the fact of the doubt is concerning whether actually being uprooted has occurred or not. So you're not wondering whether after having uprooted it can it come again. The doubt seems to suggest that it has not entirely been uprooted. So with the tree, the roots have not been entirely destroyed, which is why again you might have fruit or leaves or branches growing out of it. But when you know that the root has been entirely done away with or destroyed, it's not likely that there's this lingering doubt that it will give rise to fruit once more. So identifying the doubt is important.
다 동부 깨대교 동부 깨대버와 단도 로마도 주부 동부 깨대버 디기 자와딜라다 고 자와디 뚝구구도는 뚝 가르치고는 제제 동부디 차단 박감 감두고와 디 무슨 통구로와 디질라 양 동부 싸워지게요. 양 동부 싸워지게서 디시디 아니 동부디기 자와 매버 소민도 상바이나 나르기 동부디기 자와 매버 쇠사레데 동부 신계기 자 사변디 다당 하드 매버 쇠매버디 세우차 디 나르기 동부디기 자와 딜리 중조 마르와디 디 코로야 사변 셴버지리 중조로 와.
For instance, if you kind of uproot a tree, and then after you uproot a tree, you see that the tree dries out, all the leaves dry out, all the flowers, fruit, everything, it just dries out. But then later you see another sprout arise. Your doubt is not that that same root that you have uprooted has led to the sprout coming again. That's a different seed that has led to a different plant. Similarly, the doubt here, if you have uprooted it, is that having been uprooted, that is not going to give result to anything. There may be some other cause that could give rise to an effect.
손자다 단다 도박게딩이 니께고 왔다. 박배 고방 데모 남의 무슨도 통윤도 당고대로 통만이 못 방도와. 통만이 못 방도도 당진 군다 방도래. 당진 군다 방윤도 디기 창배 통만기 차선이 못 방도래. 통만기 차선이 못 방도도 디기 gen체제 디기 유체제 간다 예송기 풍불내에 매버 차도래. 차도래데 이나야 양결 콜라 차선님은 기기 유도 딱그 삼발라 당진 렌지 빵차네 양결 기기도 삼발해 디마래 빵차교 당진디 기기요 말 빵차교 당지 군다래 디 빵차래 다양기 기기요 말해 깨대데 가래 사빈 셴바들에 당진 렌지기 사빈 셴바들 하데바 디 매버 소마도 딜 하데 딱 거기 딜을 취시제제 딜을 취제 당진 빵차송 다 양결이야 당진 고니 계속 삼고요와 아니 디마레스 깨대바디 사변 셴바레스 세제 아니 당진이 사변데라 당진데라 군다다 행기 니체 아니 행게데라야 사변 민다고 구시에로다 사변 민다고 구요레스 어디시에로다.
So if you remember that doubt, which was when you have attained the path of seeing, you still see self-grasping arise, which is why the wisdom of selflessness is not an antidote to self-grasping. There was that doubt. What that doubt is, if you remember, was saying when you have removed those three, what was it? Fetters, right. When you remove those three fetters, that you have removed. And therefore you're not being, what the result of having removed those three fetters is that you're no longer born in the lower states. But self-grasping is still arising, and therefore the wisdom of selflessness that was cultivated, that acted as an antidote to remove those three fetters, is not an antidote to craving, because when you remove its root, you still see craving. This is the doubt of the opponent. The answer to this was, it's not like that, because what you remove when you attain the path of seeing is you remove the seeds of acquired afflictions. There are different seeds. There are seeds that are acquired afflictions, and then there are seeds that are innate afflictions. Or there are the seeds of acquired and seeds of innate. When you attain the path of seeing, you only remove the seeds of acquired afflictions, which is why you don't have those results. But when you're seeing results arise, it's not because they're arising from that same seed. There's a different set of seeds entirely. And not only are there different seeds, but then those later seeds, which are called the seeds of innate afflictions or innate self-grasping, those are further divided into 9. And so there are 9 different distinct seeds of self-grasping or of the afflictions that are still left.
꼴 구유에 나로네 다 당보방, 니바방, 순바방, 시바방, 드림바가 제제 타마델라 구와디 방도도 다 심규라 단진기 사베 용수 조버세다 단진 찌기 사베 세바 마임바체 단진 계획이 사베 용수 조버세바레 덴데 세 사베 셈텔라 카레시고레 니규 타르침베 셈 시고르다.
So then when you start working on these other seeds and you remove the first, second, third, fourth, fifth and you reach till the ninth, when you remove the ninth, then you have removed all seeds of self-grasping, which means you have removed all seeds of the afflictions and all seeds of suffering. That mind that now has attained an absence of these seeds or has been separated from these seeds is known as the mind that has gone through final transformation.
다이 캐나 삼로 데레로 스탄디 그러와 지기 가든 지 나로라 암기 사변 민저와 굿다고 서로죠. 사변 민저와 쭈다고 서로죠. 직군다체 직군다기 배체 굿이 고망기 생기 서로죠. 디 차장 매바 쇠사소나 아니 신이 계란게 가래 타쳐 그러나 디 가든 나로 다양게 암보 기 말이세디 랍투프다.
So if you think of an analogy, think of a garden which has 10 mango seeds. And of those 10 mango seeds, there is one that is now compared to the seed of acquired afflictions, and there are 9 that are different seeds of innate afflictions. Now when you remove all of those seeds, if you can be sure that you have a garden where you have removed all of these 10 seeds, then you can say with certainty that there are no more mango seeds in that garden. Think of it like that.
다 덴디기 니규 타르침베 셈텔라 다 녜바 차소 라연 계획 고급 요르베서는 요 말이스 디인디 아니 고과 담에도 비셔로 검시 당진 계획이 사비 용수 조바 직 세사소나 빵사소나 디니 양결 녜바 차소 빵발라르 도에드니 시기르베서나 다디 시기 말이스.
So in such a garden that no longer has any mango seeds, can from that garden mangoes come about? You know that that's not possible anymore. Similarly, a mind that has undergone final transformation and has removed all of these seeds, can attachment aversions arise in that mind? No, that's why that abandonment is irreversible.
디레 소자다 니규 타르침베 셈텔라 다 딘디기 당진 이 사변 용수 조바 빵차비 젤라다 빵차비 젤라 양결 가지기다 양결 집어 땅체 용수 조바 빵차바 이나야 양 코런 셈디나로라 야 랑시메와 양코 사변디 라리양 두스 모두 교륜 그레스 사변 상황 매바 쇠서는 야 사변 코런 양결 지 용그레스 라바이나 디 용신이에요 말레스 가지라나 규미기밀이 용구 말와 고 단진 라이 깨고고로 녀바 차수 깨발라 단진 깨고고래 단진 깨발라 고 규진게 원 깨고고로 마도 고 랑신기 깨고 말와 그봐 다 랑신기 기기 매바 예도 가로 고 규진게 원 깨고고 깨고도 가래 고 로디 통부 출고로다 유기 니루 나기 니루 통야라 고 로디 출고로 마트나 단진 깨 두고 말와 소도 고딜 출고로와 다 딜라 튀에라 가래 컨디션 튀투고래 튀투고 민도 김전 가르질라나 다음에 도비 로디 다음에 도비 셰랍기 고올라 데도와스 로디 다음에 베간라 데도와스 디세고다.
So what the doubt over here that that someone had was, even though all these seeds may have been removed, there is some sort of nature to the mind that will still give rise to these afflictions again, will give rise to attachment and craving once again. And so here what Acharya Dharmakirti is saying is, no, that's not going to happen. The reason why that's not going to happen is because were that to be able to arise again, it's not going to arise randomly without causes. If it arises, it's going to have to arise through causes, and for that thing to arise, a necessary, indispensable cause is for there to be some error or some mistake with the perception of a self. You have to first see a self, and then you have this base for error coming about. However, when you have gone this mind that has attained final transformation, that's always resting in an understanding of selflessness. That's always, it's kind of inextricably mixed, if you will. It's inseparable from constantly perceiving selflessness. So there is no room for this error to arise, which then can give rise to attachment and craving, etc. So that's what Acharya Dharmakirti's response was.
다 단데 빼래다 빼차샤바 단나가도 상미 줄라 담에 두비 시라 매버체 와 담에 두비 시라 매버체 다 담에 두비 시라 ngar meba sardu ke gu gorwa sardu ke gu ngar meba la sardu ke gorwa ta dikke bala bejen khade dikke bala khari che gu du nganzo dame du bishera sardu ke bala khari che gu du.
So this is a question. Right now, let's assume none of us have the wisdom that realizes selflessness, and so we need to newly cultivate it. What do you have to do to cultivate it?
Identify the object of negation and then refute it. But I don't know how to refute it.
Right? So dame du bishera ya ke bala dame du bishera ke bala gaja da ngö se ne tikka ni dame du bishera ke gu du wa dame du bishera thanda ngar me sardu ke du wa ngar me sardu ke du ine ngar me sardu ke bala khari che gu du da di ngö so ne ka ne dame du bishera ke gu du ma du shin rosa me du wa 다 디나신 다 좀바 니주 탈신 비셈델라 당진 매버체 매버차나 야 sabdike 초그레스 가진라나 다디 sabdike 초그레라나 sabdike 월 가르쳐 오래 다음에 응외송니 디까니 다드진 불로게 그래서 디모도 야.
So currently, if we don't have it, to newly give rise to it, you have to identify the self and then you have to negate it, right? That's what you have to do. Similarly, if an arhat is resting in a state of having realized selflessness, and that mind has to be stopped, and now self-grasping has to newly arise, it's comparable, right? If self-grasping has to newly arise, to make that happen, they have to do the same thing. They have to identify the selfless, the lack of self, and negate it. There is no other way to go about doing that.
So that 니규 탈친 상에 다좀바 디기 담에 응외숨니 디까토 그베 까투에 요르베.
So an arhat whose mind has gone through this final transformation, is it possible for them to recognize selflessness and refute it? That's the main question then.
민두와 디메나 가르쳐서 단단 가져 줄라 담에도 비시랑 가르메 서도 줄이 깨워나시 다좀바 당진 차상 빵체위 제라야 So
if that's not possible, then what does that mean? It means when you have attained this final transformation, at that point is an arhat able to regenerate self-grasping in their mind? And the answer is no. That's why.
단진 외손에 아니 다까고라 베진 담에도 비셔럽게기 베진 가르친 지구래.
So then the next question is, if this is how it could be, why is it that to identify the self and refute it, one needs to make effort? That's another question, right? Why does that require effort?
된다도도 딱 한다 다가에게 배전 가르친 치기요랬어. 다음에 또에게 배전 가르친 치기요랬어.
Basically, why is one exerting oneself in trying to identify the self and refute it? Why do we do that? Sepakayachi. Sepakayachi.
소자다 단지디 마가나 랑로 네버직 치기요바디 셰고로바. 당진디기 세바기기도 세바디기 둥에 장기도 나 둥에 두게면도 손자 당진디기 짜와시는 알로 네버칭이 짜와치기 요바인디 코까고도 코까에기 비즈니스에기 삼로레엘로 코 알로 네버칭이 짜와디 뭐 셰고도 봐 디나신 딱 개데 다좀바 다음에 또 비셰라까에기 비즈니스 제공도 땅다 단기 까마도 와도 다음에 고민이 수인데 까투에 요마 다음에 의수는 가자라시는 까투에 리바 요 말에 개데 베진 제가 제배왕 친주로 왕기 베진 제가 제배 있나야 디알리 베진 제기 삼로 코르발라 단단 낭신 체지 다음에도 셰럽 짜와지는 걸 내버 치기도 세기 삼로도 깨고 봐.
So it's kind of like if you want to refute it, or you like the reason why you make such an effort, if at all, you're making an effort to do this. The reason you're making an effort is because you're seeing that self-grasping, or you make the effort only after you see that self-grasping is not conducive, or it's leading to some like it's creating some problem, which is why then you make an effort to remove it, so that then through removing that you can remove craving, which then leads to suffering. So if you don't identify that it is leading to some sort of discomfort or suffering, effort in that direction will not really happen. Similarly, an arhat who has realized selflessness and their mind is resting in that understanding of selflessness, the first point is, it cannot refute that selfless, it can't refute the lack of a self, because whatever reasons it tries to do, those reasons will not work, because there is no self. That has been refuted through reason. So even trying to pile on reasons to justify or sustain and support it, that's not possible. But hypothetically still, if they were to bring it up, it would have to require some effort on their part to make them want to generate self-grasping again. And they would require some effort on their part to stop realizing this realization of selflessness. And for that to happen, it would read, the same reason applies, it would need for them to see something that is detrimental while they are resting in self-grasping, in the wisdom of selflessness. That's also not there. That was the 2 points.
어떤 디니부디 가장가죠 체와메의 양다된 라신란의 칠로기 매도 생겨 미도도 논의 대조 진실로 세기다 자와쇼로가 지구디기 된다디 시기였다.
So this was, I'll change the translation a bit if you see it yesterday. This was that verse from yesterday, which was, no harm in what is true, despite effort by wrong cognition towards nature, it cannot be reversed because cognition holds firm in that direction. So this was the meaning of those two. So the first line, no harm in what is true.
This one, 친주로기 체dunyin beba chenaya kata 친주로기 체dunyin 빵과 제발라야 콜라 네바지 통고도 그 네바 통해야 말 해서 세워매랑 신뢰도 세디시다 디체 아니 양다 되 랑신란이 친로기 슬라이드기 되네 코체dunyin 도베 체dunyin 고 도에게 쳐도 네바 제바이나 가르쳐 버려서나 당진 가에게 탑시 쳐버나신 지구지선 다음에 버디 가자를 샤제 디르비 바까네 아니 디체고 그러와 디체발라네 다메디 친줄로 임바지 구구르 마도 다메도 응어빈니스 이나 고고제기 지과요 말에 디인디 다메디 양답이 되레 랑신 친지 말로 랑신 친지 말로 응어빈니스 임바인디 고 가자라 샤네 가에게 지과요 말에 매바인디 가투예요 어디디 가장 슝디 튼두스도 튼다닝부디 디르다.
So the first 2 lines, no harm in what is true, then it says despite effort by wrong cognition towards nature. So it's saying if that is what the nature of things is, then if wrong cognition even tried to make an effort, if any form of cognition tried to make an effort towards that nature in generating wrong cognition or in fostering wrong cognition, that's not possible because that nature is one of no harm. So if it's a nature of no harm, there can be no effort by wrong cognition to take selflessness and then put that as your object and refute it, because that nature is one of no harm, so there will be no effort. Effort towards that is even hypothetically is not possible. And second, if that, assuming you could do that, even hypothetically, you make it even more hypothetical, if you could refute that self, then there might be some room for that. But the second point is that nature is what is actually true. Selflessness is actually what is true. That's really what it is. So because it is what is the truth of the thing, or that is what is true, refuting it through reason and generating or cultivating an opposing mind, that's not possible. So because the nature of the abandonments are of no harm, and the nature is that that is what is true. Wrong cognition, even if it was to make an effort, it is not going to be able to affect it, because those are the 2 qualities that it has. So that was the kind of a summary of those first 2 lines.
다 빵발라도 비 김진 생각와스 다 빵바 가지게 야 빵발라 도그레 너야 유비 빼도다 빼직 샤기로 봐 어디 빼디 되기 말에서 까기 요래 그래서 빵발라도 비 김진 생각와스
Now there's other reasons for why the abandonments are reversed, and those are now refuted. So the next section is refuting other reasons for why the abandonments are reversed.
kaji ki tsawa semin soja chunye je sukso shin
They will not cease because they are the nature of living things like form and so forth.
deba nyeba chakso seba mede soja ki chunye yimbe chir pena pumba sugi rangshin yimbe shin no shenas.
And so someone says, the commentary, faults such as attachment will not cease because they're the nature of beings, like just like a pot has the nature of form.
Da dila kaji ki pe khar jabare sukso shin sede pumba sugi rangshin yimbe sonza pumba sugi rangshin yimbe yindu ani pumba su da khatewa sueyo marwa dina shin cheje nyeba chakso seya yoresne yo mares 가실라나 심진기 춘이랬다. 심진기 랑신랬다. 다가도 된다도도 르이 랑신레 생겨서로지. 다 로이 신지랑 코나 랑신라 차소 차고 여버레 생겨서로지. 그다 가지기 디셔로다.
So the example like form and so on, what they're saying is, it's like trying to take a pot and make it not be form. But because a pot's nature is to be form, it cannot be separated from being form. And so what they're saying here is, it's like that. Attachment and the mind are like that. Attachment is like the nature of the mind. The mind, by nature, has attachment as a property. Not as a property, but as its nature. And therefore, attachment cannot be done away from the mind or cannot be removed from the mind because it is the nature of the mind. And trying to do it is like trying to take a pot and make it not be form.
다 랑루기 자와텔라 민 마투치르 님부 초단 대와는 독바타냥 통치로스.
It is not so because it is not established and because when applied in the direction of the antidote, their reversal is seen.
소자기 대바 소자기 춘이이나 소자의 데미룬와 인고발라 님부터 독바 통치르스.
If it was the nature of living beings, it would have to be inseparable from sentient beings. But because by the power of an antidote their reversal is seen, the faults such as attachment are not established to be the nature of living beings. Therefore, the reason is not correct evidence in the proof of that. That reason is not correct evidence in the proof of that.
다 녀바 샤소 소자기 춘이임바 마주보 손자 아니 소자기 춘이임비 칠 녀바 샤소 세야 메스 녀바 샤소 세야 메데 소자기 춘이임비 이치세 따디 룹제 양다 마레 그 따디 두기 민도스 디치 따디 따 디두기 룹제 양다 민노스.
So this reason that they're giving, which is take faults such as attachment, it follows they will not cease because they're the nature of beings. This reason that you're giving, which is this last line, this reason that you're giving is not correct evidence to prove that attachment will not cease.
다 된두 와스 녀바 넘바 가바니 사신 라연 게메데 대단 얘기 델메데 태와신도 망해시르스.
So a summary of this is, faults that have thoroughly ceased, unlike solidity, will not arise again. Because of being the very entity of that, it is inseparable. As with ashes, there is no certainty.
Deba sergi shuwa sawala lar dogba shin nyeba number gaba layan kewa mede kyo dame tobe sherabki tobki gaba khanshi dame tobe sherabdi nigyu tarchin be semgi danyidu chuba nigi semla deme yimbe cheros.
So unlike the solidity of gold that can be reversed, faults that have thoroughly ceased will not arise again because they have ceased through the power of the wisdom realizing selflessness, and because the wisdom realizing selflessness has become of the very entity of a mind that has reached final transformation, which means it is inseparable from the mind.
Tan number suyan nyegoe chigde di nyegwarta. Pena chakso yinare danzin yinare kanda logi gyuen kandiji yinba yinaya ko panga donyongdu niyore. Ngungyurwa go nyon seji. Ngungyurwa go nyon seji da digi sabyon pang seji niyore. Da ngungyur go nyon sabyon mabang na layan ngudu kyurgyong kore. Rishik ngudu kyurgyong mare de jela layan ngudu kyurgyong kore. Di tul shaa kore. 문주로와 매바 차바티 아니 사변방비 계자 말 콜라리 깨와 매바 차비 계자 말에 고 사변 세면나 고 양경무도 교리용 그래 봐 배낭아주 니쿠비 내가블라 왕시무도 교리 말에 왕시무도 교리요 말에 디네 왕시계획이 다 규매바 차비 계자 말에 라야 니 세유는 거 왕시계획도 와 디나신 시제 다음에 또 비셔럽 곰체 당보 예바 차수 문주로 와지 곤용기제 디네베 카도 될라 문도 그래메 주직 차도 그래 디 차베 카도라 땅은 예바 차수 방송 삼바이나 디 노바래 디도 빵기요 말에 예바 차수 빵기요 말에 양 고갑직라 양 예바 차수 라리 문도 교림 그래 디 가르치라나 사비오 마방바디 계자래 그래서 다 단다 디 가르치고 얼시디 단다 디 셰디 다음에 또 비셔럽기 톱기 사변디 빵소나 텔라 니주 탈침 바시고래 다음에 또 비셔럽기 문주보 고는소나 텔라 니주 탈침 바시기요 말에 어디 미에고래
One more thing for all of you please to keep in mind is there is a difference between suppressing and eradicating. When you say you suppress certain mental states, suppressing them means that you can temporarily make them not manifest, or they do not temporarily manifest for the duration that they are suppressed. When you say eradicating, then eradicating means that you have removed the seed which will then not allow them to manifest ever again or anymore. So please keep in mind that there's a difference between these two. For example, when we sleep, our eye consciousness is not manifest, it's not functioning. But that doesn't mean that our sleep has eradicated the seed of our eye consciousness, because later when we get up or when we wake up, then our eye consciousness becomes manifest and active once again. So if when we engage in certain practices, if we are able to suppress or subdue certain mental states and we feel that that is now having attained the result or the abandonment, please bear in mind that that is not true. That's not necessarily the case. When we say you have attained an abandonment over here, when it says wisdom realizing selflessness has become of the very entity of a mind that has reached final transformation is not a mind that can suppress the afflictions or suppress craving and attachment. It's a mind that has eradicated the seed, which is why it has reached final it has reached final transformation. So please keep this distinction very clearly in mind about suppressing certain states and removing seeds for them. There's a huge difference between these two.
Nyeba number gabani slide damet to be sherab gitogi nyeba number gaba said sabyon gabala kogoramadu munjuwa gabal kujumer.
So here when it says faults that have thoroughly ceased will not arise again, this thoroughly ceased does not mean that they are no more manifest. That's not what this means. Okay, what it means is the seeds for them being manifest or the seeds for them arising have been removed.
That dameto be sheragi nyeba nam sabyen de cheba pha gas sabyen de cheba pha gas habe negap thela ngajo khatangi shubna shin gas gabe negap ge sem thela kharsigre ni jutachim be sem sle gurwa dinde gi ni jutachim be sem di ta dameto be thedani gi delme thang sle de dinde gi ni jutachim be sem di 다음에 또 비셔럽다 단위 찍도 교대버지 다 군이 오직도 교 뒤내가 군이 오직도 교네 다 셈라 간다 셈데 다음에 마도바 다음에 유도 마치바 깝메 가두이는 다음에 강도 시지다 데메시를 내대버지 어딘데지레스 디인디 대단히기 델메 당세디 디순고요.
And apart from, or not apart, but beyond having ceased the faults thoroughly, the other quality that it has is because they have ceased through the power of the wisdom realizing selflessness. So that's the first part. And then because this wisdom realizing selflessness has become of the very entity of a mind that has reached final transformation. So this mind that has reached final transformation, now the wisdom that realizes selflessness has become one entity. one substance. It is inseparable, which means from that state onwards, it always remains in a state of realizing selflessness.
디제 다 커지기 예번 남바 가바 라인 계획 빼들라 세기 슈와디 사와라 라르 도고 빼자고 빼티낭시 빼티 자용디 아니 담에도 베셔라기 예바 사변 빵차버디 세기 슈와 라인 사와라 도고 나신디 마레스 디 칸디도 주여레나 아니 태와 나시레스 부싱 메기 텔라라 규르차와 나시레스 다 부싱 텔와라 파 규르사나 텔와디 부싱라 춤 미도과 대신도 추도야메바 나신체제 아니 심주디 예바 차소 용어를 기규메바지 담에도 베시라기 쇠사나 라야 셈디 아니 예바 차소 용어를 기용고르베슬라나 기그마리스 라야 예바 차소 용어 도구르베슬 도그마레 아니 부싱 태와 유바나시레스 어디 송버시.
Then with that last line, as with ashes there is no certainty, I'm not sure there's no certainty is just the best way to say it. But the opponent here said like the solidity of gold, when you melt it, then that can be reversed. Similarly, the afflictions will arise again because they're comparing it to the solidity of gold. And Acharya Dharmakirti's answer is it's not like that example. What it is like is with ashes, which is when wood has burnt and it has turned to ashes, then it is certain that it will not revert back to wood. So there is no certainty is actually more definitive in the sense that it is certainly not, something like that. Right? I'll have to think about this again, the right words. But basically it's saying with firewood, when that has burnt and it has turned to ashes, unlike the solidity of gold, that those ashes, they do not return to being solid like firewood once before. It's certain that that will not arise once more.
디 옌키스타 디 옌기 방발lar 미도버 드뷰 고네 뉴지 방베 고과테 둥엘lar 미중위 태와 임바 당스 둥엘lar 미중위 태와 임바 송자 녜중세 남바 시바체 다음에 또 비셔라디 녜몽 때네 세지게 람 임바 템베 디 녜진 세지 람댕기 남바 시바 디디 고댕기 녜중기 남바 당 람댕기 녜징기 남바니 주바치기 셰바 예노스.
Till here, by establishing that abandonments are not reversed, cessation, that is an abandonment of the afflictive obscurations, is shown to be a separation from suffering which does not return. And so this addresses the aspect of definitive emergence, which is the fourth aspect of the truth of cessation. And then the wisdom of selflessness is shown to be a path that definitively eliminates the afflictions, which is addressing the fourth aspect of the truth of the path, which is definitive deliverance. So this single explanation, this explanation explains both the aspect of definitive emergence of the truth of cessation and definitive deliverance of the truth of the path. Therefore, this aspect is an antidote to the mistaken view with respect to the truth of the path. Is an antidote to the mistaken view that there is no path that can definitively eliminate suffering.
디 고댕기 넘버 셰윤디 가장아서 고댕기 넘버 셰윤디 고바시와 캬놈디 셰사르바 고바시와 캬놈디 셰다 니중디 다 탄다 람덴지 가서 셰디 티르다.
So if you remember when we looked at the truth of cessation, we only touched three aspects, and the fourth aspect, so we did cessation, peace, and sublime state. And now the fourth aspect, which was the definitive emergence, we said we were going to, it will be addressed further, so that's where this is addressed.
다 넘버 디니스 다 탄다데 니진의 넘버 셰샤바 니징이 넘버 셰샤바 디 넘버 디니 둥에 텐세도 쳬베 람 메버즈임베 록슈기 냠보 오세제다 람딩기 넘버로 록버슈바 아니 둥에 세제기 람 요마레 세기 토바직 야 예바 말루바 봉지기 냠보 마레 세기 토바 데네 담에도 베셔라 둥이 테니스 버셔베 다 테니스 버스는 양제 게임에 주 송에기 람디 마레스 레기 텐도 세제기 람 요마레스 디 로보 록슈기 냠보 텔라 다 탄다디 송기 요레.
And then, because this aspect with respect to the truth of the path, it is eliminating the wrong view that there is no definitive path. So the first wrong view was that there is no path, then that the wisdom realizing selflessness is not a path, and now there's this doubt which is that this path is not a definitive path because it cannot definitively eliminate suffering. And so this aspect is addressing that path, that aspect of the truth of the path, which has the wrong view that thinks that this path, whatever that might be, cannot definitively eliminate suffering.
딱 가르치면서 다음에 또 비셰럽디 시발의 투제기 다 람임바디 가서 계제 시에버다. 람임바 계제 시에제 람임바 계제 시용도 아니 알릉거는 시발 투제기 람임바 당보디 시에로와 디 시에윤도 가서 딘시 가르쳐 버래.
So what we've gone so far with the truth of the path is we have shown that the wisdom realizing selflessness is a path that liberates from suffering. Do you remember what the reason for that one was? The reason why the wisdom realizing selflessness is a path that liberates from suffering? Yeah. Can you say it loudly? Just say it loudly so that everyone hears it, and just please bear this in mind, the reason for why it is.
Because through familiarization, through familiarizing with it, the abandonment of all faults, which is complete transformation, is attained.
Do you remember the root verse for this?
From familiarization in the path that was explained comes transformation.
시신 람디 콤발레 니 큐르스 자와 디모드메도와 다디 라메도 비셰르 시벌 투제기 람도 템비 자와체 딘시 탄다디케치.
So that's the root verse, and then the reason is that reason, yeah? So the root verse is just 1.5 lines in Tibetan, and then the reason is that one.
다탄다 시신 람디 콤 시신 세디 다메도 비셰르 ngar 시신 다메도 비셰르 디셰 시신 람 따디 람 세디 가르레 람 세디 룹주추 셀와 시벌 투제기 람 인데스 ngar 시신 다메도 비셰르 추진스 시신 람 세디 시벌 투제기 람 인데스 시신 람데 콤발리 니유르 슬라이디 테 콤발리 니유르 세디기 다메도 비셰르 콤발레 녀바말르보 빵데 니유 타침보 토바 유위지 딘시.
So the root verse, which is just a very short one, which is, how is it in English? Can you say it again?
From familiarization in that path was explained comes.
Right, so what it's saying is, from familiarization in that path that was explained, right? From familiarization in that refers to the wisdom realizing selflessness. That path is the predicate. So you're trying to prove that which was earlier explained is the path, and the reason is because through familiarization, transformation is attained. It leads to transformation. So that's how you have your whole syllogism from that. Is that okay?
Tanda laba nashi de tinsin laba nashi kyo komba le nyeba malu ba bangde ni gyu tarshimba ani toba gyurna siba le tujige lam yimba de la kyabadi le labu thum tuk tuk re kyabar jubel kale yomare ta kale khaksa kaware chokju jube ta jube dire.
So again over here, like earlier with cessation, I'm going to change this root verse again. With the same with cessation, once you prove the reason, the pervasion again is very easy to understand. What's difficult, like with the truth of cessation, is that the property of the subject is harder here. Or that's what requires more attention in this syllogism.
So that the tinsin nanglo khande do shesin lam te khombali ne gyuru se de te khombali ne gyuru se zawa digi tembe tinsi di nanglo la desin sumdo wa desin thangbo de kharere kyo khombale chikche kyo khomya yoba kyo khombale se de tabe khomba tarchimbale se gorwa kom jani khombale se de khomya yobi geje chikche godwa kyo khombale nyeba malu ba pangde se de nyeba malu ba pangwa kyo kombale nyeba maluba pangba sudi dindi khang gomje gi dame to be sherab digi nyeba maluba pangire se ani pangba somdo mase jikpang sabati laryan so dogu mare tarchim niju tarchim chagires soza kyo kombale nyeba maluba pangde niju tarchim ba toba gyubi disen somdo wa
ki gombale se gombale tarchim bala shower
kyo kombale so gomni se borwa
so in the reason because by familiarizing, so here it's a part that liberates from existence. Because by familiarizing with it, so the first part, familiarizing with it means that it is something, so when you're saying by familiarizing with it, means that there is a state where it has become familiarized. There is a state from where onwards it is now familiarized. That's the first part. When that happens, there is the abandonment of all faults. That's the second part that you're trying to prove, that it has the ability to abandon all faults. And then the third part, this means that final liberation is attained, final transformation is attained. So there's three parts. Familiarizing with it, the abandonment of all faults, and there can be final transformation.
다 디인데 다 당보 가래래 남에도 비 셔럽 추지 교 곰니 교 곰체 아니 곰바디 탐해버치네 폐 요리요 말이스 스디 폐 요리스 교 곰발레 교 곰니 곰바 체진도 만에 버치지 탐에도 폐 요리스는 요리스 당부 디게지셔.
And so to address these points one by one, the first one is you can familiarize with it. So familiarization is possible, which was if you engage in it, it has the quality or the property of being able to be familiarized. So its nature is one that can lead to familiarization.
와, 다 남에도 비 셔럽 곰소나 곰바 체진도 만에 버 탐에도 폐 요와 탈슬라나 네 여데슬라나 랭가르자오레.
So if we say take the wisdom realizing selflessness, it follows that through familiarization it can increase indefinitely. And again, indefinitely in English, if you remember in English, meant that it becomes spontaneous, right? It wasn't like a quantitative thing where it just keeps growing in amount. It becomes the moments, subsequent moments, they can carry on spontaneously. That's what it meant, right? So if you find a better word, then just let me know. But right now, that's what it means, okay? Now, if we say, is it a state that can increase indefinitely? What's the reason for that?
다디 자와 제용도 자와 응을라 템 미템 바탕 공바 체준도 네베 디시드 응을라 갸브체 아니 랑신 텐다 마인테세 칙디기 된 거다.
So in the verse where it's explained this, it first gave an example of not being a stable base or not having a stable base, and an example of something that is not, or something that is not possible for it to not require repeated effort. It giving an example of that too, then it said, this is not its nature, or it is not its nature. So by showing that this is not its nature, it's showing how actually it does have a stable base and it does not require repeated effort.
다 딘스다디 랑신 텐다 마인테 세디기 딘시 텐다 텐템바도 콤시 베즈 자말라 메덴바디 이테 다 디기 딘시 디기 가르차소 남에도 비 셔럽 곰소나 곰바 체진도 메네바 탐에도 피기 요바디 디투.
So this, by giving this reason, which is its nature is not like that, it's showing how it has a stable base and how it does not require repeated effort. By this not requiring repeated effort and having a stable base as evidence to prove that it can increase indefinitely through familiarization, it is showing that familiarization is possible.
다 니바디레 다 딘데기 남에 또 비셔라디 곰소나 니바 말루바 빵기르베 니바 말루바 빵와 타스 니바 말루바 빵투와 타스나 데다 니바 말루바 빵투비 김젠 카리레 슬라나.
So then the second part, which is this wisdom realizing selflessness, it follows it can abandon all faults. The answer is yes. And so then why can it abandon all faults? What's the reason? Dancing in Yapuchevich.
아,
Dancing in Yapuchevich.
디 돌둘 납샤다.
That's a little too short.
다도 나가 자와 단기 자와 도셔주는
So we're trying to connect all of these various bits with the root verses and the commentaries, no?
Because all faults arise from self-grasping. And it's the way Abraham project is directly contradictory.
선상 둥에당 녀바 멀르베 당진 둥에데 녀바 멀르베 자와 임바 간시 그 당진다 진당 개와 임비 와 어디르다 다디 그 자와 가장 가서 조차고 와
And we've done that. The root verses, we've gone through that, right? Okay.
디딕소와 딘시디 지글랍도 거네
Just say, the reason once, just say it once loudly so that we all hear it. So take the wisdom realizing selflessness. It follows it can abandon all faults.
Because all faults arise from self-grasping, and the way it apprehends its mode of apprehension of its object is directly contradictory from the apprehension of self-grasping.
디차소와 다 녀바 멀르바다 둥에 멀르베 자와 당진 임바 간시 그 당진의 진당 개와 임비 치슬라바이나 다 가지기 진당 개와 점기 텔러 뇌고나 아니 차소기 착배기 셰당을 뇌아타 차과도 셰당이 진당 개위 치스 람나 디기 랭카르야오
Then to this fact that if it is directly contradictory or its mode of apprehension is contradictory, there was this opponent or there was someone who objected by saying, well, in that case, take attachment. It follows it is an antidote to aversion because its mode of apprehension is contradictory with that. What was the answer that was given for why it's not the same?
Because they have a common cause and because they are cause and effect.
Gyujichitam Pensunginde.
당진 규신 징이 당스 유더 디부 ngobuchers 어디기 아니 진당 개와 점기 뇌가 말이지 디르바 다 도체제 키나도 단도 자와 개심부 힘부 요와디 중난 논란이 도체 자와양 기술로 시마도 nen가케 시마도나 양 개요 말이 이네 시마도나 간다 디나라 셰셰베 땡시디 딱딱다도 주 아니 어디 니 말을 레신 수수 꽤 아니 삼을 마야다.
So that's how you do it, no? You start with the text, what the main thing that is trying to be shown, you get that, and then when you understand that, if you can remember the corresponding verses, that's great, but if you can't, that's not a problem. But at least remember all the various reasons, try to bring to mind all the reasons that are given to explain or prove all the various parts of the original position that we're trying to prove. And if you do that, and you can list them all out and bring them to mind and reflect on them every day, then you have like an order of how to proceed, right?
단단가 가르 땡기도 쓰나 녀망간조 디 리우니바 랑종 집에 가도라 아니 간조 주로 숨수여래 숨시 그래서 간조 주로 시도 소상 간조 주로 시 아니 샤나 좀 아니 데바사는 거 먹고 같이 안 자와 베저 미지기 자와 되체 안 자와디 마교 안 디카도 최전 가르래 세와 가르래 딘지 가르래 안 지기라야면 지기랍 딘데 제정가도 류니바 강사 랑종 도신치
I remember when we were studying this, that four of us, we came together and we sat down, and without any commentaries, just with the root verses in front, we would recite the root verses, and then while reciting the root verses, we would try and identify what the subject was in that root verse, what the predicate was, what the reason was, how it was explaining all of these things, without ever relying on the commentary. And if one was unable to remember it, then the other person would help. And so that's this combined effort. We went through the entire second chapter just through the root verses, bringing to mind everything that was explained in it.
다 디나시 캐나조 공다 라블었던 거로 딘지 제도나 자와야 뽕 중나 제바다 먹어체 자와디샤 아니 자와디기 된다디 된다 추진디디 지기망예바 지기망에 도시 라블었던 제바이나 야고이메
So when you're meeting in the evenings, if you can try this sometimes, that also might be helpful, which is just, if you can, then just bring the root verses out without looking at the commentary, then try and go through the root verses and remember what the reasons are and think about the reasons. And if one person doesn't remember something, then as a group you can all contribute to kind of get an idea of how it's proceeding and how the reasoning is working.